Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, it's not deja vu. We're back with a Boyuurange A50, or the Boyuurange A50, I'm not sure. Yeah, probably the same company. We've been over this little amp before. We've done a whole video series on how to mod this thing to get better performance out of it. So I had a viewer emailed me that lives nearby, said, hey, since I don't have to ship it, it makes sense to have you go through this thing and do your upgrade mods to it. And so I agreed. We did the Skunky mods, which Dolly approves of, and got the upgrade caps, put some Mundorf aluminum oil coupling caps in it, and did just what I thought it was going to do. Huge improvement in performance and in the sound, especially the bass response. So, again, done a build series on this. I'm not going to show how to do these mods. I'll put the link below to the video series or the playlist about doing the mods on one of these. But I just thought I would go through one more time, kind of a refresh, because at the time people were saying, oh, you just got a bad one. They're not all like that. Well, yes, they are all like this. And I know that schematic. I tried it in my own DIY amp and it didn't work. And so, maybe if you have like 1 watt needs with some super efficient speakers, that this thing would sound okay. But even then, it's got a ton of distortion. I mean, it starts out right at the gate at 1%. At, 0.05 watts, it's got 1% distortion. And so, there's no way this thing is ever going to really be a good sounding amp. And rolling the tubes doesn't fix that. So you folks that are saying, oh, these tubes are bad, actually, these are some PS vanes out of a Wilsonton R300, which are basically the same tubes that this comes with, and they're not bad sounding tubes. So, anyway, let's jump into showing the before and after testing. If we got time, we'll do a little tube rolling, and then we'll wrap this thing up at the end with my review and suggestions on what this amp's all about. Okay, so we've got the stock A50 with PS vane tubes and the Russian 6H8Cs with the rectifier tube these come with. And here is the power versus THD. You can see we're at 1% distortion out of the gate. Comes up here. We cross 2% distortion at a 0.5 watt. Get up here to 1 watt and we're at 3.2% distortion. 2 watts, we're at 5% distortion. And the test ends here at under 4.5 watts at 10% distortion, which I don't think anybody's going to listen to. So, as I've said before, if you get some super efficient speakers and you're listening at this less than a 0.5 watt level of power, I could see how possibly this amp sounds pretty decent. But if you need that little power, you can get that out of the EL84 triode strapped, put out 1/4 of the heat this thing's pumping out, and using a lot less electricity, smaller footprint, and likely it's going to sound better. So we're going to look at a couple of other tests here. Also to note, the VU meters on the front go into the red at 2 watts of output. So that might give you an idea of how much power you're using if you have one of these amps. And looking at the VU meter, if you're in the red, you're over 2 watts and you're into some massively heavy distortion. So let's look at the frequency response curve. And this is pretty much what I hear listening to this amp. And if we look at these numbers up here on the upper right, you can see this flat line here is at -1 dB. And then down at 20 hertz, we're down close to a dB and it's just the weak bass response that I hear from this amp. But if we look up here on the upper end, this roll-off's pretty reasonable. I know this looks like more, but there's no music going on in this area that we're really listening to. The one thing to note is that it's not doing some crazy dive to a short like the R300 was doing. And I think this roll-off that we're seeing here in this lower frequency range is more related to the circuit than the output transformers. And we can see that if we come over here and look at the THD versus frequency. Down here at 20 hertz, it's the same as it is up here, which is showing me that these are actually pretty decent output transformers. And it's what I've said about this little amp in the past, that while these output transformers are not ISO Tango quality, they're not terrible. And there's other things about this little amp that are causing the problems that we're seeing. Again, you're using some kind of horn speakers that are only using like a half a watt of power or less at your listening levels. This amp may be okay out of the box, but it's basically a half a watt 300B amp. And we're going to do what we can to fix this thing because I know it can be improved. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to let this thing cool off. We're going to swap in some JJ 300B tubes. We're going to swap in some new old stock 6 SN7s, and we're going to put a 5AR4 rectifier in it and see if that does anything just tube swapping without changing any of the internal parts. Okay, so here we are with a 5AR4 rectifier, some GE 6SN7 GTBs, and a pair of JJ 300B tubes. And as you can see, identical measured results. So anybody that's telling you, oh, it's the tubes that they come with that's causing the distortion or causing these problems, and you can just roll in some tubes and magically fix this amp, that is not reality. You can see here at a half a watt we got 2.2% distortion. We got 3.2% at 1 watt. At 2 watts we got just under 5% distortion. And then up here where it peters out, got maybe a little more power before it hits 10% distortion right there at 5 watts, but yeah, that's not enough to shake a stick at. So the tubes are not the problem. Again, if we look at the frequency response curve, we see this roll off down the bottom end is still going on, and then frequency response versus THD looks the same. I think it's time to dive inside this thing. I am not going to redo a video showing how to mod this amp. I'll put a link in the description of the mod series I did on this, since this is a deja vu video of revisiting this little amp. So let me go inside, do the mods. Probably going to show you a little different mod that I think I'm going to do on the power resistor, on how to put it in and let it dissipate the heat. But other than that, it's going to be the same mod we did previously, going from a cascade to a cascode. So let me do that, and we'll come back and measure the results. Okay, so here we are after we did the modifications, and honestly the majority of the modification on this amp is on the front end. The output tubes end up being biased just like they were. I did replace the cathode resistors with these 50 watt units, mainly to get more surface area, and then I attached them like this using some thermal double stick tape to the side of the chassis instead of them floating over the circuit board, where eventually it ends up roasting the circuit boards in these amps. And so These are just some inexpensive 50-watt resistors that I got off Amazon. And again, it's not necessarily for the wattage rating, but I wanted to get enough surface area for the double stick thermal tape to transfer that heat to the chassis. And you can definitely feel the sides of the chassis get pretty hot now. So, especially where the resistors are. So I'll put them back here in the back. And once you've done this mod, you do need to be careful. You could burn your hands touching the side of the amp, but it's better than that heat being trapped inside the amp, killing the capacitors. So here is the THD versus power now, and you can see it starts off down here at 0.25% of distortion, and 1 watt we've got 0.4%, 2 watts we got 0.5%, 3 watts we got 0.75, and crosses 1% distortion at 4 watts, which is where before it started down here at no power, at 0.01 watts, it was making 1% distortion. Now it's making 4 watts before it hits 1%, 5 watts 1.5, and then right in here is about where the amp starts clipping. So we got about 6.5 watts. This is with these PS vane tubes like these amps come with. The ones I'm running in this amp came out of a Wilsonton R300, but it's basically the same tubes. And I've got the 6H8C tubes in the front end. Be interesting to see how these JJ tubes perform in this area right in here. But here's the big one. Look at the frequency response. And this is putting out more power at this level that we're testing it at. This amp does have a little higher drive need than it used to have, but still 1 volt RMS will drive it to clipping. So it's not an issue. It's just not hypersensitive like it was. So once you do this mod, you'll probably have to turn the volume knob up. You might have to turn it up halfway to get it to play at the level that you want to hear, where before you couldn't turn it up past 1/4. And it doesn't mean the amp's making less power, it's just the input sensitivity is lower. So anyway, you can see the frequency response is flat now from 20 hertz to 10K, and then even at 15K you're down maybe 3/4 of a dB, and 20K you're down about 2 dBs or thereabouts, 1.5 dBs. There's no music up in here anyway, and honestly most of you guys are watching my channel that are over 60. You don't have any hearing up here anyway, so if you're like me, so not really a big deal. This is the range that I'm concerned with, and especially down in here. If you want to get good bass response, this is what you need to see, is it flat down in this area. So then we come over here to the THD versus frequency, and we see this little curve here, which is pretty normal to see, and kind of expanded this so we can get a better range through here. And you can see by the time we get to 100 hertz, it flattens out. What we were seeing before wasn't a curve, it was perfectly flat, but it was up here at 5%, and that was just all the distortion that the front end was pumping out was overriding any distortion that the transformers were making. Now that we've cleaned up the front end, we are seeing the actual THD coming out of the transformers, and this is not bad. I've seen way worse, and you'd have to spend probably $1,000 on some ISO Tango iron to get anything better than this. Replacing these with some Ed cores isn't going to make enough difference in this area to even hear. So unless you're willing to spend $1,000 on some output transformers, the ones that come in this amp are perfectly fine. So as you can see, huge, huge, huge improvement. And now this amp is usable up to this 5, 6 watt range. I mean, I would listen to it in this range. I would say now this is like a 2 to 3 watt, maybe 4 watts listening with this stuff in here for headroom. And before, it was a half a watt of output. And the only thing this thing could really be used with would be some horn type speakers that have over 100 decibel efficiency rating. Now this amp can be used with almost any speakers in the 90 dB and up range. So last thing I want to do is I want to pop in the other tubes that the guy brought over here with the amp, which are some new old stock GEs for the front end and some JJ 300B tubes, and we might even pop in a pair of those 300B-Z tubes and see what those look like. So let's do some tube rolling and see what kind of results we get from that now. If you notice before, rolling tubes did nothing, which is a sign that the amplifier has a poor design. And remember, this is a zero negative feedback amp. So to get this kind of performance with zero negative feedback is pretty impressive. So let's pop some other tubes in and let them warm up and do another pull on the amp and see what that looks like. Here we are looking at the THD versus power with the new old stock tubes and the JJ tubes. So for this segment here that I'm recording, I tried just the input tubes and they didn't make a huge difference as far as the measured performance. So I popped the JJ tubes in and it's actually got a little bit more distortion in this range here. Anyway, we come over here to the THD versus frequency and we've got the same curve. Seems to be the same here on the low end. And then I didn't show you in the other one, but there's the second order and there's the third order harmonic distortion. So one thing that I noted is the JJ tubes seem to have a little more second or even order harmonic distortion than the PS Vane tubes did. And again, that's probably where we're seeing the little bit of extra distortion up in here is second order harmonics, which is not a bad thing to have. So I want to do one last test. I want to see what this thing does with a pair of 300B-Z tubes. Also realize that these are fresh tubes. They've got 20 minutes on them, if that. And so after some burn-in time, in a couple of hours, they may test a little different. Anyway, that's for another day. Let me pop some well burned in 300B-Z tubes and see what they do, and then we're going to wrap up this video. Okay, so here's with the 300B-Z Shuggy tubes, the black coated treasure models, and you can see we've got very similar looking THD versus power that we saw with the JJ tubes, but when I did the THD versus frequency, got about the same THD here, but then when we go just the THD instead of the THD plus noise, pretty clean, a little bit of noise there, but when we go to the second order, it's almost identical to the THD, and the third order drops down here. And so what you're going to get from these 300B-Z tubes is more second order harmonics and less third order harmonics. And honestly, that's why a 300B amp needs to be zero negative feedback so that you can hear the difference in the tubes. When you start applying especially global negative feedback to try to tame the harmonic distortion because of some design problems elsewhere in the amp, you end up with an amp that all the output tubes sound the same, which some people might say that's great, that a cheap China PS Vane tube's going to sound as good as a $1,200 or $1,500 Western Electric tube. But that's not why you buy a 300B amp. You want to hear the difference in the output tubes. And you only get that when you have zero negative feedback. So anyway, if you got the money or you can find a pair, I would get a pair of these 300B-Z tubes. I said that the last time that I worked on one of these, and that hasn't changed. So anyway, I think this is a great place to wrap up this video. Well, as you can see, just like last time, massive improvement in the performance of this amp doing the skunky mods to it, which didn't shock me at all. And from the tube rolling, I did listen to this amp with 3 different 300B tubes. These are Wilsonton branded, but they're the budget PS Vane tubes. Pretty sure they're the same tubes that this A50 comes with. These are pretty decent sounding tubes. The viewer brought over a pair of JJ 300B tubes, which actually get pretty good reviews, and I just didn't really like the way they sounded. Now, again, they may need some run-in time. I know that, especially with 300B tubes, they do need to burn in a little bit, a few hours, and I didn't do that. But to me, just out of the box, they sound kind of woolly on the bass. It's just kind of fluttery. I don't know, I just didn't like it. And so, again, these have some time on them. And so, maybe it's not a fair comparison. I've also heard those JJ tubes like to be warmed up really good before you listen to them. So, maybe that was part of it. I don't know. But I didn't see there was some huge upgrade going from these to the JJ tubes. And I've also tried the Electro Harmonics 300B tubes. Wasn't impressed. Now, I've heard good things about the Gold Lion 300B tubes. They're a little more money, but hey, maybe they're the ticket for a budget 300B tube. Personally, I like those Shuggy Treasure 300B-Z mesh plate 300B tubes with the black coating on them, and put those in this amp, and it sounded better than either these PS Vanes or the JJ tubes. And you can still find those tubes out there. Again, they're a mesh plate type 300B tube, and they work fine in this amp. And here's the other elephant in the room. The other budget 300B amp that's kind of in this spectrum is this Wilsonton R300. And I just feel this is a really bad 300B amp. And out of the box, without doing anything, this amp does sound better, and it has more power before it goes into clipping, but there's really nothing you can do to fix this amp cheaply to resolve the problems it has. I think the newer versions, they started using a 5AR4 rectifier, a pair of 5AR4 rectifier tubes like I was recommending when I first reviewed this early version, and it's ridiculous that they're even using a pair of rectifier tubes because they're running them in parallel. They're not even, it's just wasting your money. You got to go buy 2 rectifier tubes because it won't work with just one. They're paralleling the plates like this thing's got enough power to need that, and then they try to pitch it as being some kind of a dual rectified power supply. That's not even what's going on. It's not like one of these tubes does one channel and one does the other. It's not designed like that. And then it's fixed bias, so you got to screw with keeping the tubes biased. Where this is cathode biased, you don't have to worry about it. And then the other issue with this one is this amp has a bunch of global negative feedback to try to deal with the distortion that the front end design is creating. And you're using 3 different driver tubes. You got this 6SL7, which I'm not a big fan of how 6SL7 sound, and finding a good sounding one isn't easy. And then it's got a pair of 6S and 7 tubes, and then the 300B tubes, where this amp has 2 less tubes. It's just got a pair of 6 SN7s, which are fantastic sounding tubes, and then a single rectifier. So when you do have to buy tubes, it's a whole lot cheaper to have this amp that you're buying and rolling tubes into than this one. And to me, this amp is just unnecessarily complicated when you can just cathode bias a 300B single-ended amp, and there's no reason or no advantage to having a fixed bias other than it's something you got to monitor and adjust. And if something happens with this bias adjuster pot, which they notoriously use cheap pots in these things, if the wiper goes open, the tube can red plate and blow up, and then you've wasted a nice 300B tube because the amp ate it. Where with cathode bias, that can't happen. Now this amp does have to be modified. So if you're not capable of doing modifications, I would not buy this amp. And unlike the A12, the modifications required by this amp are a little more extensive. You have to basically pull all the wiring off the front end tubes and wire up this cascode where you got resistors going back and forth, and I mean that's why this guy brought it over to me. He didn't feel comfortable doing it himself. And you know, the output section really doesn't need to be changed, other than on this mod I did change the cathode resistor to this 50-watt unit that looks like this, and I mounted it with thermal tape against the chassis on the sides here so that the heat would transfer out of the chassis. So that was a kind of a new mod. Instead of making that kind of complicated heat sink plate like I did the first time around, I decided just to go with massively oversized resistors that I got off Amazon. They were pretty cheap, and some thermal tape, and just tape on the inside of the chassis. You don't have to do all that fab work. So that will simplify the mod for people. The other thing this one has in its favor is it's got good output transformers. I mean, yeah, they're smaller cans, but realize that these cans on this R300 got a bunch of epoxy and gravel in them, taking up most of the space, and the iron inside them just isn't that much bigger than what's inside here. And these don't have that weird dipsy doodle issue where the amp's trying to short itself out at 15K like this amp does. And honestly, even with upgraded using Hashimoto output transformers, this one still does not sound as good as this amp does after the skunky mods, and this is about half the price. So if you know how to do some mod work and you can follow those videos, this is a really good deal. And it turns out to be a nice sounding little amp. Not quite as good as my DIY one, mainly because these output transformers still aren't even the equal of like some good Ed cores, or obviously not as good as some ISO tangos. I mean, I guess you could swap these for some really nice ISO transformers and have basically the same thing as my DIY amp in this chrome plated chassis, which you might like the look of, and be a lot lower price point and not have to do all that fab work. So that might be an option for some of you, is to buy this, then mod it, swap the output transformers for something really good, and you know, for way under $2,000 you're going to have a nice 300B amp. So that's going to kind of wrap it up here. Thanks to you folks supporting the channel. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, please like the video. Thanks to you folks that entrusted me with your gear to do stuff like this so I can make content for the channel, and they also end up with a nice sounding amp when they're done. If you're interested in having this done to one of these, the issue is the shipping. It's going to be $250 back and forth, and then by the time you spend another $250 or so doing the mods, you get $500 into a $500 amp. And so this is really more of a DIY kind of a thing. If you're local, it might make sense. Anyway, you can shoot me an email. And again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Until the next time, have a nice day.